Proverbs 17. Appreciate your prayers for my grandmother and my trip out of town. It was last minute, but my brother and sister both came down from Michigan, and so we got to spend a couple of days in the hospital, and then got to share a hotel room with my brother, which is always interesting. I try to get his theology straight every time we're together, and he does the same thing to me. So we sat for a couple of hours and argued about some stuff in the Bible, and I just enjoyed it, and thankful that my grandmother is doing better. I think she lured us all there because she wanted to see us. I don't think she was as bad off as she pretended, but she's 88, so she that's fine. It's okay. She can do that. Anyway. We've talked the last few weeks about the faith-filled family. We've seen already the construction of a faith-filled family, how that God put it together. We've talked about the components of a faith-filled family, and last week we talked about the companions of a faith-filled family. This morning we'll talk about the communication of a family that's filled with faith, and we'll just use one verse as we jump off, and I'm assuming that Ken and Diane are tuned in, and so we love you and miss you. We're glad you're able to be with us online, and I trust you get better soon. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse number 1, just that one verse, it says, "Better is a dry morsel and quietness therewith than a house full of sacrifice with strife." So when we talk about communication, Proverbs, he says, "Better is a dry morsel." Anybody like to eat a meal with, we were talking about just before Sunday, before church, Wesley and Barry and I, anybody like to eat their meal with nothing to drink? Anybody like that? No? Nobody does. I'm ignoring that hand, Luke, because I know better. Because we don't like a dry morsel. It doesn't matter how good the food is. We want some liquid to go with it. And Proverbs is telling us here that it's better to have a meal with nothing to drink and quietness therewith than a house full of sacrifices that comes with strife. That word strife is a word we would use. It would be arguments and chaos and upheaval and just trouble in a house. And so it's important. Our communication within our home is important. It matters to our children how husbands and wives interact and how we teach them. And so I just want to give you three things this morning. I don't actually think this will be the shortest message in the series, but three things, areas of communication we need to make sure that we are paying attention to if we're going to have a faith-filled family. And look, the truth is, all of the good intentions in the world don't matter if when we go to execute, it doesn't work well. And the way we talk and the way our homes communicate, it does matter. It sets the tone for everything else. And so, if you've got your Proverbs chapter 17, let's look at a couple more verses. Look at verse number 27 also, and 28. We'll just go ahead and read them. He says, "He that hath knowledge spareth his words, and a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit." Verse 28, "Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise, and he that shutteth his lips esteemed a man of understanding." So Solomon puts it in a much wiser way than we were, but as I grew up, I always heard this: it's better to remain silent and appear stupid, you know what the next part is, than open your mouth and remove all doubt, right? And that's what he's talking about, communication here. And as he goes throughout, as Solomon, he talks several times about our words and how communication affects us. We're told in the book of James that a man that is able to control his tongue is a mature Christian, because our tongue is difficult. He says that we've put a bridle on the horse and we steer it. With just that bridle, we put a rudder on the back of a ship, and that great ship is turned about by just a small rudder. And then he says, "So is the tongue, and though it's a small member, it boasteth big things." In fact, another place it says that our tongue is set on fire of hell, and it's trouble. And so, not just outside our marriage, but within our homes, it's important that we understand the importance of our communication. And so, if you're married this morning, there's some things we can learn. If you're a child in a home this morning, there's some things we can learn. If you are not married, but you may be someday, there's some things we can take and learn about communication within a home. And then if you're just a Christian, communication makes a difference in the way we live our lives. In fact, in Sunday school this morning, Brother Tim in the book of Colossians read a verse, and it says, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt." And what great advice that is. You know what salt does? It makes everything more palatable. People don't like hospital food, not because they can't cook, but because they don't add salt at all. And then you add a little bit of salt on food and it just makes it better. And that's the way our speech is. If it's with grace, it's more palatable. You can say some difficult things to hear if it's done with grace. And so our communication is important. Let me give you 3 things this morning. I think they're going to have your scripture that we just read, so let's just hurry along. Number 1, we talk about communication within the faith-filled family. Communication should be thoughtful. It should be thoughtful. That is, there should be something, there should be a purpose to it. If you do much reading about the Amish, we lived up in Indiana for a long time, and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Ohio were kind of the most populous place for Amish people, and Mennonite as well. And one of the things, if you do much reading about Amish, is they're quiet, not because they don't want to talk, but because part of the way they live is that your words are important and you ought not to waste them. And so we ought to take that and apply that in our lives. The Amish don't do a lot that we agree with, but that would be one that we could take with us and apply that to our lives. And communication should be thoughtful. In fact, communication in our lives should have, I don't know why the word repeat is up there. It should be with affection. Communication should have affection in it, should be with affection. I don't know why the word repeat is there. We read in Sunday school, Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. Look, the truth is there's no place in a Christian home for rude and disrespectful communication. It just doesn't have a place. Now, that doesn't mean that husband and wife can't disagree, that kids can't disagree, but the rude, harmful communication just doesn't have a place, and we ought to set the standard and the line in our homes that we just don't allow that to be our normal pattern of speech within the home. That we can disagree. Standing in a hospital room with my grandmother, she is a hardline Democrat. Talking about like Democrat. I hadn't been there 10 minutes, and she asked me who I voted for. And I knew how this was going to go because I remember I tried to get away from the answer and not do with it. She said, but did you vote for Trump? And I said, the truth is, whoever's in the White House, I want our country to do well. That's what I told her. And then she goes on, and she said, well, you know, the last time we had a balanced budget, it was a Democrat, Bill Clinton. I was like, yeah, but if you remember right, it took a House controlled by the Republicans and a Senate controlled by the Republicans to get that done. And so it took both. But my mom, who knows better, just went at her. And then now there's an argument in the hospital room. And then she drags my uncle into it, and he's a Democrat. And so I really thought there was going to be a civil war in the hospital room. So I just kind of stepped out for a minute. But the truth is, as we disagree, we can disagree with each other without being disagreeable. We can disagree and state our opinions within a marriage, within a home, with our children, and to our parents. We can do that at the same time. We can keep our speech, we can keep our communication thoughtful. That is, it can have affection in it, even in disagreement. And so we ought to be careful. This rude, disrespectful communication should not happen between spouses, husbands and wives. You can have disagreements without insulting your spouse. You ought to. Look, you picked him, you picked her. When you insult him or her, you're insulting your own taste at the end of the day. The Bible says that they two shall be one flesh, and so when you insult your wife, you insult your husband, you're really insulting yourself, and so that's stupid. And so we make sure in our marriage that our communication is a communication that is affectionate. That is, it is not rude or disrespectful. It should not happen between the siblings, and it should not happen between the spouses. It should not happen especially from kids to parents. You just ought not to put up with it. Look, your kids will be set on a path for success if you just teach them how to show respect to those who are older than them. We live in a society and in a culture where that is a lost art. You teach your children yes ma'am and no ma'am, yes sir, no sir, and they have already a head start in their lives because it will set them apart from everyone else. And so we ought to make sure that our communication is affectionate. It has affection in it. There's just no place in the Christian home for swearing, profanity, for the Lord's name in vain being used. It just ought to have a place. Husbands and wives, you should never and you should not tolerate from your children. And our communication ought to be communication that is thoughtful, that is, it has affection in it. Not only does it have bring affection, but also communication should reveal accountability. It should reveal accountability. Husband and wives need to simply communicate. It ought to happen. You can't have a relationship of any kind of value without those two parties talking to each other. And so our communication should reveal accountability. Hey, basic human decency, husbands and wives ought to know where each other are all the time. It just ought to be the case. You ought not to wonder where she is, and she ought not to wonder where you are. It just communicate. We ought to be teaching this. And if we are accountable with each other, then it's not a problem when we expect our kids to be accountable as well, because they see the consistency there from husband and wife. And then when you expect them to be consistent in accountability, when our kids get older, rules change and rule sets change and enforcement changes and things get to where you're not enforcing a rule so much as you are just be a decent human being. And when our kids, well, most of them moved out at 18. Hannah was there a little longer while she was in school. But we went from, hey, you have a hard curfew of this time, to, hey, would you just tell us if you're going to be late? Could you just let us know? Just be accountable to us. That's what we're asking. Just tell us where you're going to be in the general vicinity. I just need to know if you're heading towards Statesboro or towards Hinesville, so if something happens, we know where to look. Look, we ought to have a communication that is a communication that brings accountability, and so we ought to talk to each other that way. And so it ought to be affectionate. It ought to be accountability. It ought to bring accountability. Our communication should also reflect appreciation. It ought to reflect appreciation in our lives. Thank you. You're welcome. I appreciate you. You look nice. Please, thank you, excuse me, all of those things. Our communication within our home, look, as parents, we're setting our kids' expectation to communication outside the home. It ought to be the very best it can possibly be within the home. That means not only between spouses, but even as we interact with our kids, we ought to be respectful and have appreciation towards them as well, so that they're learning how to interact with each other and with the world around them. We ought not to allow screaming and hollering and hateful talk amongst each other. That is spouse to spouse and kid to kid and kid to parents. It just ought to be a home. Our communication in a faith-filled family should be with appreciation. This means we have to deal with it, moms and dads, when the communication doesn't meet the level that we've set. It means we have to deal with it when they fall short and make sure they understand that this is not acceptable. We're not going to put up with it. When we have a communication that is filled and reflects appreciation, we will not hold grudges, we'll forgive and we'll forget, we'll not hold mistakes over each other's heads. You and I both know that words spoken in anger are rarely thoughtful, but often hurtful. And that's why Proverbs says, even an idiot, if he keeps his mouth shut, some people think he's smart. A verse that I found in Proverbs a long time ago that helped me in my own life, it says, he that uttereth all his mind, a fool uttereth all his mind, but he that is wise keepeth it in until afterward. Now that doesn't mean you take your feelings and you shove them deep down where they never get out, but what it does mean is in the heat of a disagreement, maybe wait just a second, collect your thoughts, let the emotions subside, and then decide if what you're going to say is helpful or hurtful. And if we'll judge our own communication before it comes out of our mouth, it will make our relationship with our spouse, with our kids, a ton better, because we won't just speak those things that, look, my wife and I have been married to be 25 years in 3 weeks. She knows exactly how to push my buttons. She knows. And she knows better than anyone else. I know how to push her buttons. And as a result of that, if we ever disagree, which we never do, that's a lie. As a result of her knowing me and I know her, when we have disagreements, if we're not careful, we can get to that game where we're just going to say what we know is going to be a problem, but it's not at all helpful. And a marriage and a home that's going to have communication that is appreciative, you're going to keep those things in and say, yeah, I could say that, but that's not going to help. And I don't really mean it. So I'm going to hold it in and maybe we'll let it go. Like, if I call my wife her mother, probably will not make it to year 26. And if she called me my dad, same thing. I don't want any part of that. Because she doesn't mean whatever good qualities my dad has. I know if she pushed that button, it would be hurtful and not helpful. And so what I'm saying is, in our relationships, we're going to have communication that is first of all, it is thoughtful. That is, it is spoken with a purpose. That passage in Colossians chapter 4 that Brother Tim read in Sunday school and that we read here, he says, look, let your communication be with grace, always seasoned with salt. Listen, that you'll know how to answer. That is, if you'll trust the Lord to help you with your speech, everything you say will be beneficial. It won't be a waste of your time. You ever had somebody that could say a lot of stuff and never say anything? It seems, I've known several people in the military, and it seems like some that get up a little higher in the military, it's almost like a skill set they teach. To be able to say a lot of things without really saying anything. And I've been, I try not to do that from the pulpit, but I've been around guys that do. Like that guy preached for an hour and 20 minutes, and you're just thinking, what did he say? Well, he could have said it in 5, right? So what we ought to do is make sure that our communication within our home is communication that is thoughtful, and not just thoughtful. Let me say secondly, before we get, let me just give you some more verses if you're taking notes this morning, because Proverbs is so helpful. Proverbs 29 and verse number 22 talks about communication. An angry man stirreth up strife, and a furious man aboundeth in transgression. Screaming and yelling just doesn't belong in a Christian home. Proverbs 15 and verse number 1, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Do you know when you go to school to become a law enforcement officer, one of the skills that they have to teach, it's a soft skill. It's not self-defense. It's not using deadly force. One of the skills they have to teach is this skill of de-escalation in conflict. Why do they do that? Because they understand if an officer shows up on the scene where emotions are already riding high and he goes in at a 95 out of 100 and he's raised his voice, all of a sudden the people around him are going to raise their voice, and now we've escalated something that could become very dangerous. And so they teach them how to de-escalate. Within our marriage and within our homes, it would be really good if we could take Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turneth away wrath. Do you know sometimes even in disagreement, a soft answer will assuage that problem in our marriages and in our homes? If we'll just decide we're going to turn away wrath with that soft answer. But here's what he says next. But grievous words stir up anger. And so our communication, it matters. Proverbs 18, verse number 13. He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it's folly and shame unto him. I have somebody in my life, it's not in my home, so it's not my wife or my kids, but there's somebody in my life that I just came to a realization about 2 weeks ago that when I'm talking to this person, they do not care what I have to say. They just don't care. Be in the middle of a conversation telling something important, and you can see the look on their face. They're already on to what they're going to say when I'm done saying whatever it is that I'm saying. Anybody else been around people like that? Do you know what that person is doing? He's doing the opposite. That he that answereth before he heareth a matter, it's a shame and a folly unto him. And sometimes this person, you can have a conversation and they'll jump in with something that's not related, not because they're dumb, because they just weren't listening, they weren't paying attention. Their thoughts are more important than the conversation and the thoughts of others. And look, within our homes, we ought not to ever be that way. If you're going to have a disagreement with your spouse, hear them out. They may have a valid point. What I found so often is that when my wife and I disagree, it's not always I'm right and she's right, but sometimes it's somewhere in the middle that maybe both opinions are there. God gave me her and gave her me for a reason, and the reason a lot of times is that her perspective is different than mine, and mine is different than hers, and two good sets of eyes on a situation are always better. And so we see that he that answereth before he heareth it is folly and shame unto him. Proverbs 21 in verse number 9. It is better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. And I'm just going to move along. Proverbs 25 and verse number 24. It is better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman. Verse 13 of chapter 19. A foolish son is the calamity of his father, and the contentions of a wife are a continual dropping. What I'm saying, Christian, is that our communication within our home, it ought to be thoughtful communication. It ought to add to the house and not take away. Look, that doesn't mean, listen to me, that does not mean that sometimes there has to be conflict and disagreements. It has to happen, especially as we raise our kids, because they will not always see eye to eye with us. But even in those conflicts, even in those disagreements, we can still have a home that's in harmony, even in the middle of that difficult. So our communication ought to be thoughtful. Number two, communication within our home should be truthful communication. See Proverbs 17 and verse number 7. Proverbs 58 verse 3, the wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. When you and I exercise within our homes, with our spouse, with our children, when we exercise communication that is truthful, this brings more trust. We see that we teach this to our kids all the time, don't we? That look, if you want me to trust you, then do what I've already asked you to do. If you want me to trust you, then tell the truth. And as your kids are being raised, one of the things you have to teach them is that even if you're going to get in trouble, let's be honest about it so we can deal with it rather than hold on to it, and then we have a whole other problem. And so our communication needs to be truthful. This brings trust. It says in verse number 12 of Proverbs 29, if a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. That is, if he hears lies and he lives a life of a lie, all of his servants are wicked. Everything that he does then, and the people around him become that. The home should be a safe place for the truth. We ought to example this to our kids. You know what that means sometimes in our homes? It means admitting to our children that we've made mistakes and that we're wrong. As bad as sometimes we hate to admit that, we have to come to our kids sometimes and say, look, I did this and I was wrong. I've caught myself having to do it a bunch. And then especially as now the kids are out on their own, you have disagreements and sometimes they're right. Boy, it's tough to admit that the kids are right when you were wrong about something, but it's important. Communication needs to be truthful. Parents need to use discernment with our children. We talk about truthful communication. Your children do not need to know everything going on in the world and in your lives. Husbands and wives, if you have a disagreement, your kids don't need to even know it if you can help it. That's not being dishonest, but they don't need to be burdened with what they cannot help. We've heard the phrase, ignorance is bliss, and it is so true. Children don't need to be put in the middle of a conflict. If we have someone in the church that's been married and divorced, and now they're having to co-parent and step-parent, we ought to be very careful that we don't drag our kids and put them between those two spouses and make them part of the problem. It's just not fair. It's not fair. And so when I say you have truthful communication, that doesn't mean you have to just share everything. You've been around those people that within 5 minutes of meeting them, you know everything about them, including the stuff that you do not want to know? Been around those people? I had met a preacher, it's been about 2 years ago. He moved into town, he since moved out, and so you won't know him, but I met him at a preacher's fellowship, and I know what it's like to be the new guy in town because I was that a while back, and so I just gave him my card and said, hey, when you get a chance, I'd love to buy your lunch and sit down and just talk to you, just to get to know you a little bit. And he called me the next morning. So we made an appointment. We went to eat, and I found out way too much about this man within 30 minutes. Just way too much. This guy admitted to me he moved into town to pastor a church. He admitted to me that he'd misled the church that he was now pastoring in order to get just the church. He'd been divorced. And that's a problem biblically for a pastor. And so he didn't tell this church he had been divorced until they already voted him in. And he's telling me this and just some other things. And I got home from lunch with my wife that afternoon. And I said, "We're not going to be friends. Now I know too much. I can't even look at the man the same way again." And look, if that's the case with a stranger, your kids don't need to know every single thing going on between you and your spouse, especially if it's negative or will cause them to have negative thoughts of your partner, your spouse. You ought to work in your life to make your kids have the highest possible opinion of your other half. You ought to be working to build them up in the eyes of your children rather than tear them down. And so we ought to make sure that even though we're talking about truthful communication, we need to use discernment with our children. Home should be a safe place, and they don't need to know everything that goes on between spouses. Don't drag them in to try to settle a score. It's just not a good idea. And we ought to expect from our children, husbands and wives, not just from ourselves, but also we ought to expect honesty from our children. This is teaching them integrity. And another one of those skills that will serve them as they go on to be adults themselves. We need to deal dishonesty when it happens within our home. We know when our kids are being truthful, when they're not, and when we know that they're not, there ought to be judgment and action taken. Don't let those little lies go, because those little lies will come bigger lies. And look, kids that aren't parents in here, you ought to be dealing with your parents and with people around you with honesty and with integrity, and your communication ought to be truthful. When people hear you say something, they should be able to count it as the truth. Dealing with these things now will save us from having to deal with adults that can't lie or can't tell the truth later on, and then it's not going to be us that punishes them, but it will be society, and that's much worse. And so communication ought to be thoughtful, it ought to be truthful. And then let me say, thirdly, this morning, our communication within the faith-filled family ought to be thankful. It ought to be thankful. It doesn't take a whole lot to have a home that is quiet and peaceful and loving. But communication that is thankful, and I don't just mean thankful to God, although we'll talk about that in a minute. Thankfulness is a uniquely Christian characteristic. I was heard this week. I was listening to the news, and it surprised me actually. 86% of Americans believe in either God or a higher dwelling spirit, which is a weird way to describe it. But that's what it said. 86% of Americans believe in either God or a higher dwelling spirit. I'm not sure what that higher dwelling spirit would be other than God, but that's what they believe. And yet, you can't look at 86% of Americans and think that they are thankful to that God for things that they've got. Because the truth is, just because you believe in God doesn't not make you a Christian or have a relationship with Him. We know the devils believe and tremble, the Bible says, and yet they're not in relationship with the God of heaven. Thankfulness and being thankful, it is a uniquely Christian characteristic. We ought to be thankful to each other within the home. We ought to, husbands and wives, we ought to audibilize. We ought to speak our appreciation for our spouse on more than once a year on Valentine's Day and on Mother's Day or Father's Day. We just ought to do it more. We ought to. The reason for that is that brings harmony, that brings peace, that brings an element to the home of calm, because we appreciate each other. And when I verbalize it to her, or she verbalizes it to me, it reminds that other person of those appreciative characteristics in our lives. And so we ought to be thankful. This is a characteristic that's important within our homes. And by the way, not just to each other, not just to our kids, and not just to our parents. We clearly ought to be thankful to heaven for our home. For our home. You married a spouse that is godly, and you've had a marriage that is, even if it's not perfect, it is working. You ought to be thankful to God for your spouse, your partner in life. You have kids at home, we had better be thankful to God for their health and for our relationships with them and for the things that we have now. There are many people in this room whose kids have grown and gone, and it becomes exceedingly abundantly clear how quick life changes. And we ought to be thankful for those times that we have. And our home ought to have communication that is thankful. Thankfulness is, it does have value. It does a few things for us. When we are thankful, it keeps us humble, which is always good. It keeps us humble. Do you know what the Proverbs says? Solomon figured this out, and the man had like 1,000 wives, so he would know about challenges in relationships. But here's what Solomon said in the book of Proverbs: only by pride cometh contention. Only by pride cometh contention. Well, contention is just something between you and your spouse. Contention is anything that is a disagreement that gets beyond just a disagreement. Only by pride cometh contention. You know what? One of the ways to prevent pride is to be thankful in my marriage. I can be thankful to God for my marriage, for my family, for my children. I can be thankful to them for who they are. And when I do that, it reminds me of who they are, and it reminds me of who I am, and that I don't deserve all the blessings that God has given me. It reminds me of who God is. It also reminds me, when I'm thankful, of how good God is. It reminds me of how good God is. You've heard my wife and I talk, especially over the course of the last 2 years, as our 2/3 of our kids have gone. It makes us thankful for when we get them together now. It makes us thankful when we see our children making godly and good decisions. It makes us thankful, but it also reminds me, as I'm thankful, it reminds me that it is only by the grace of God that my children are doing what they're doing, because they could be doing other things. And I realized that it wasn't me. It wasn't the way that I raised them. My wife is a much better parent than me, but even as good as she is at being a mom, it wasn't her. It is the grace of Almighty God that our children are doing what they're doing. And we ought to be thankful for that. We ought to be thankful for that. So thankfulness is valuable because it keeps us humble. It reminds us of how good God is. And let me say, we have to teach our children thankfulness. A lack of gratitude is disgusting to see. We know that. We've seen it. We've seen it. You've seen someone be given something and it's not enough. They want more. You've seen somebody receive a gift and they weren't appreciative of the gift because it wasn't exactly what they wanted. They wanted why? Ingratitude is disgusting. And yet if we're not careful, we won't raise our kids. If we don't train our kids to be thankful, they will become adults who are ungrateful. And this will shine through in their work life, in their relationships, in their spiritual life. So we need to be teaching our kids to be grateful. Lack of gratitude and murmuring and complaining, all of those things erode a Christian family and a Christian home. We ought to work in our homes to develop an atmosphere that is one that maintains a contented spirit and one that is satisfied. A happy Christian home is not based on the price of stuff within the house. It's not based on the amount of things that we have or the number of cars in the driveway. A home that is Christian and is contented is based on realizing that God has provided all that we need and being thankful to Him for that. And when our attitude between our husbands and wives, and we allow our kids to see the same thing, that look, we may not have everything we want, but we certainly have more than we need. And we teach our kids to be thankful for those things, look, the home becomes just so much more harmonious and calm and peaceful and safe because our attitudes have changed. 1 Timothy 6:6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse number 8, food and raiment, let us be content therewith. Hebrews 13 and verse 5, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for He has said, I'll never leave thee nor forsake thee. What I'm saying is, for the Christian home, we ought to be truthful, thoughtful, and thankful in our communication, both to each other and to our God. 2 Timothy 3:2, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, and unholy. Those are things that come out in conversation. They ought not to be anywhere within the Christian home. He says, neither murmur ye in 1 Corinthians, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. That is, when we're not thankful, we begin to murmur, God, why haven't you given me more stuff? So we ought to make sure that we're working to have communication that is reflective of a faith-filled family. It's communication that is thoughtful. It makes a difference. It has value. It's useful. Communication that is truthful. It's honest. And communication that is thankful. And it breeds the right attitude within our Christian homes. Would you bow your heads as the piano player's coming? Lord, I pray that you help us to have the right communication within our home. It doesn't matter how good our marriages are. It doesn't matter how good the homes and relationships are within our church. All of us could have better communication. Help us to be thoughtful as we speak to our spouses and to our children, and our children to the parents. Lord, help us to be truthful as we speak to each other. Let's breed an attitude and an atmosphere of truth. And God, help us to be thankful in everything to each other and to you for what you've given us. That'll reflect in the rest of the way we live our lives. For those that, Lord, maybe some of these things are not as prevalent in their homes as they'd like them to be, I pray that you help them to set the decision today that they'll work towards thoughtfulness and truthfulness and thankfulness within that communication. Lord, if there's someone here that's unsaved, would you save them today? For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Would you stand as we sing?